At 69, Deborah stood frozen on a snow-covered sidewalk with $3 in her coat pocket, watching the landlord change the locks on 42 years of her marriage. Evicted, destitute, and completely alone after her husband Thomas passed away, she had nothing left except a heavy brass key and a forgotten deed to a half-acre patch of frozen Minnesota woods he had bought in secret 50 years ago. Desperate for shelter, Deborah spent her last few dollars on a bus ticket north. But when she finally reached those woods, she didn't find empty land. She found a rusted steel shed standing deep in the snow. And when she turned that key in the lock, she uncovered 13 metal boxes hidden inside, a paper trail from before her marriage that revealed Thomas had spent years searching for someone. Someone whose identity would force Deborah to question everything she knew about her own family. At 69, Deborah counted $3 into her palm and understood, for the first time in her life, exactly what nothing felt like. The landlord had already changed the lock. 42 years of marriage sat behind that door. Thomas's old work shirts, the chair he never let anyone else sit in, the kitchen table where they had eaten 10,000 quiet dinners. She was not allowed back inside to get any of it. What she still had fit in her coat pocket. A brass key, and beneath it, folded into a small square, a deed for half an acre of land in northern Minnesota. Land with Thomas's name on it. Land Deborah had never once heard him mention. He had bought it in 1970 for $80, 5 years before he and Deborah married. He kept it hidden through 42 years of marriage, through birthdays, through anniversaries, through 42 years of nights at that kitchen table, and he had never said a word. 3 months after his funeral, Deborah had no savings, no winter shoes, and one question that wouldn't let her sleep. What had Thomas been hiding, and why did it matter enough to keep secret his whole life? She could have called Sarah. Sarah was 2 hours north in Duluth. They had known each other for years. But Deborah had never been close enough to her to explain why Thomas always seemed strangely protective whenever Sarah's name came up. Pride stopped her hand every time she reached for the phone. She had knocked on every other door that morning. All of them had closed. At the bus station, she stood between two signs, Shelter Intake and Northbound. She bought the northbound ticket. It made no practical sense. It was simply the only direction that still felt like it belonged to Thomas. The bus pulled out, and Minneapolis slid backward through dirty glass. Deborah held the deed so tightly the corner cut into her thumb, and she didn't loosen her grip. Somewhere past Duluth, the highway narrowed and the forest closed in on both sides. Deborah turned the leather tag on the key over and over, reading the coordinates stamped into it like they might rearrange themselves into an explanation. For 42 years she had believed she knew a man who came home smelling of sawdust and pine, who fixed things without being asked, who never raised his voice. That man had never mentioned a single acre of land 80 miles from where they slept every night. The bus let her off outside Hibbing after dark. 1 bag, $3, a key. She had expected the deed to lead her to an empty patch of trees, a mistake, a scrap of forgotten paperwork, nothing worth the bus fare. But the county filing mentioned something else entirely, a registered structure. Thomas hadn't just bought land, he had built something on it, and locked the door. If you enjoy emotional mysteries about ordinary people uncovering extraordinary secrets, subscribe and stay with Deborah's story. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. By morning, Deborah's shoes were soaked through and her fingers had stopped feeling like her own. She pushed open the door of the first diner she found in town, mostly to get out of the wind. The man behind the counter looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Her coat, her hands, the way she hovered near the door instead of sitting down, and set a bowl of vegetable soup on the counter without asking her order. He draped a wool blanket over the empty stool beside her. His name, stitched above his apron pocket, was Lyle. He didn't ask why a woman her age was walking into his diner alone at sunrise with a single bag. Deborah almost pushed the blanket back. She had spent a lifetime refusing things she hadn't earned. But the steam off the soup blurred her eyes before she could argue, and her hands finally stopped shaking around the spoon. A local shopper paper sat folded on the counter. While Lyle refilled someone's coffee, Deborah opened it out of habit more than curiosity and stopped on a county notice listing tax-delinquent parcels. One parcel number matched the deed in her pocket exactly. Her eyes moved down the line beneath it. Registered agricultural shed, private land. The shed was real. Thomas hadn't left her a worthless stretch of frozen woods. He had left her a place, one he had gone out of his way to keep separate from every year of their marriage. "You know that parcel?" Lyle asked, noticing her face change. "Yes," Deborah said. She didn't tell him about the key. She didn't tell him the coordinates on it led directly to that same address. Outside, the wind pushed snow sideways across the road. Deborah folded the paper, tucked it inside her coat, and turned north. She still had $3. But for the first time in 3 months, she had somewhere to walk toward. The trail gave out so suddenly that Deborah almost walked past it. One step, frozen weeds were dragging at her jeans. The next, the trees opened onto a clearing, and a rusted steel shed stood between the black pines. Walls streaked brown and gray, roof bowed under decades of snow. It looked like exactly what the title of the deed had promised. Nothing. A ruin. A waste of a bus ticket. Deborah pulled out the brass key anyway. The lock was bigger and heavier than it had any right to be for a shed this size. Her hands shook as she fit the key in. It stuck. She pushed harder, twisted, click. The door swung open, and cold air rushed past her, carrying the smell of cedar, old metal, and paper. She had braced herself for broken tools and empty shelves. What she found instead was a clean oak work table under a covered window, and on it, 13 metal boxes, each one labeled with a year and a state: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas. Deborah touched the first label and pulled her hand back, like it had burned her. Thomas was 23 in 1970. Why would a young carpenter travel across half the country and keep a filing system of exactly where he'd been? She opened the Ohio box. Inside, motel receipts, handwritten addresses, and a photograph of Thomas, younger than she had ever seen him, standing beside a woman Deborah did not recognize. Underneath it, a newspaper clipping. The headline was short and merciless. A young mother had died shortly after giving birth. The infant had been placed in temporary custody. Deborah sat down hard on the edge of the work table. The boxes weren't a hobby. They were a record of 13 years Thomas had spent searching for someone he had never mentioned during 42 years of marriage. And every box stopped just before Thomas arrived in Minnesota. Just before he met Deborah. She reached for the next box. That was when she heard the footsteps outside. Someone was walking toward the shed. Deborah froze with her hand still on the lid. A shadow crossed the strip of daylight under the door. The handle turned. An older man stood in the doorway. County jacket, a folded shovel resting against his shoulder. His eyes went from Deborah to the open door, to the boxes laid out on the table, and something in his face went very still. "My name's Calvin Reed," he said. I knew Thomas. He had known Thomas, and Deborah realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. He had been waiting for this exact moment for years. He nodded at the boxes. "Those need to stay closed." For 42 years, Thomas had kept this land, this shed, and everything inside it hidden from us or Now a stranger was standing in the doorway, telling her not to look at the one thing that had finally started to explain why. Deborah reached for the next box anyway. Calvin stepped forward to stop her, then stopped himself. He'd seen something. A small pencil mark beside the box number, one she hadn't noticed. It matched a mark on the back of the photograph in her hand. Not decoration. Instructions. She turned the photograph over. Thomas, younger and thinner, stood beside the same woman from the clipping. Between them, a bundled infant. 3 words, in Thomas's handwriting, small enough that she'd missed them the first time. Find her first. Who was he looking for? Deborah asked. Calvin exhaled like he'd been holding the answer for a long time. Thomas told me if you ever made it out here, you'd find Sarah's name in one of these boxes. He never told me what you were supposed to do with it once you did. Deborah's hand went still over the Pennsylvania box. Inside, a motel receipt, an investigator's invoice, and a note dated 1972 with a child's first name written across it. Sarah. Deborah stared at the name. She knew Sarah. She had met her years ago, but she'd never understood why Thomas had always seemed strangely protective whenever her name came up. Calvin hadn't come for the land. He'd come because Thomas had given him one job, 3 years before he died, and told him not to finish it until Deborah walked through that door herself. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Thomas's handwriting. The postmark date stopped her cold. 3 years before he died. 3 years in which Thomas had sat across the kitchen table from her every night, already knowing whatever this envelope said, and had said nothing. Give it to me, Deborah said. Calvin held on a moment longer than he needed to, the way a person does when they already know the truth is about to cost someone something. Then he let go. Deborah broke the seal. The first line alone put her back on the workbench. Thomas hadn't written that he was sorry for the shed, or the secrecy, or the $80 acre he'd hidden for 42 years. He had written that he was sorry for what he had done to Sarah. Deborah read the sentence twice before it settled into something she could hold. Sarah was Thomas's daughter, not Deborah's, not the sister Deborah had grown up with. Sarah was the child Thomas had lost before Deborah ever entered his life. Elena, the woman in the photograph, had died shortly after giving birth. Thomas was 23, broke and buried in grief. Elena's parents, wealthy and furious with grief of their own, had taken the baby during the custody fight that followed. Thomas believed for a while that if he worked hard enough and gathered enough proof, he could bring his daughter home. Every year of searching took him further from that outcome, instead of closer to it. Then came the part Thomas had never found the courage to say out loud. Not once, not in 42 years. He had found her. Sarah was living in Duluth, raised by a family who clearly loved her. Thomas had watched from a careful distance before he ever let himself get close, learned her school, her habits, the shape of the life she'd built without him. He never told her who he was. He wrote that he'd already taken Sarah's mother from her. He couldn't bring himself to take her family too, to walk into a settled, happy life and turn it into a second custody battle, a second loss, just so he could finally say the word father out loud. So he chose silence instead, and carried the weight of that choice alone for the rest of his life. Deborah lowered the letter. She had spent years believing Thomas's silences meant he didn't trust people enough to let them in. She understood now that she'd had it backward. He had carried the pain so no one else would have to. Calvin spoke quietly from the doorway. He kept the shed standing for one reason, not the land, not the money. It was the only place he could keep the truth without forcing it onto her. Deborah looked around the cold room. The rusted walls, the 13 boxes, the oak table Thomas must have built with his own hands. It didn't look like evidence of a man who had abandoned something anymore. It looked like the shape of a promise he'd never gotten to keep. Thomas had left the truth to Deborah because she was the only person left who could decide whether Sarah deserved to know about the father who spent 13 years searching for her. She could call Sarah and lay the whole truth on the table. Or she could do exactly what Thomas had done, protect the peace of a woman who had no idea any of this existed. Deborah had spent her whole life solving her problems alone, quietly, without asking anyone for anything. This was the first problem in 69 years that couldn't be solved that way. She thought about the $3 folded in her pocket. For 3 months, that number had meant everything she'd lost: security, dignity, the ability to take care of herself. Standing in that shed, she understood it had never meant that at all. It had just been the excuse she needed to stop asking for help. She folded the letter, walked outside into the wind, moving through the pines, and took out her phone. For the first time in years, she called Sarah. Sarah picked up on the 4th ring. Deborah stood beside the shed with Thomas's key still warm in her hand and told Sarah everything: the eviction, the deed, the 13 boxes, Elena, and the father Sarah had never known was still searching for her. She didn't soften the parts that hurt. Silence stretched on the line. Then Sarah asked the only question that mattered. Why did he keep looking? Deborah looked through the open shed door at the table where Thomas's whole hidden life sat laid out in metal boxes. Because he loved you, she said. He just didn't know if loving you meant staying or staying away. Sarah drove up 2 days later. Neither woman arrived angry. They arrived carrying years of a distance they'd both let happen, and neither one tried to pretend otherwise. Together, they stepped into the shed for the first time as women who finally understood what had kept them apart. Deborah set the brass key down on the oak table. She didn't need to carry it as proof of a secret anymore. It had become something else. Proof that Thomas had spent his whole life trying, even in the years he believed he'd already failed. Deborah kept the land. She repaired the shed board by board and turned it into a warm room with a bed, a lamp, and a lock that opened from the inside. Her half-acre in the northern Minnesota woods became something neither she nor Thomas had ever planned for it. A place where a broken life could still turn into shelter for someone else's. One winter evening, months later, a young woman knocked on Deborah's door with $3 in her coat pocket and nowhere left to go. Deborah recognized the look on her face immediately. She'd worn it herself, standing outside a locked apartment door with the same $3, believing it meant she had nothing left in the world. She pressed the brass key into the young woman's hand. The key that had once locked away 42 years of Thomas's grief had become the key Deborah now used to open a door for someone else. She had walked into that shed, searching for whatever Thomas had hidden from her. She walked out understanding what he'd been trying to give away all along. A second chance for the people who need it most. If Deborah's story meant something to you, subscribe for more stories about second chances, hidden truths, and ordinary people finding their way back to each other. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Deborah?